After 12 years, my husband announced he was leaving me. Not for another man, but because I was no longer inspiring enough for his grand destiny. He expected me to shatter. He expected me to beg. When I just calmly asked when he'd be moving out, his entire world broke. He couldn't accept a quiet ending, so he stayed to destroy me. But his smear campaign led me to dig into the finances of his beloved charity, and I didn't find a non-profit. I found a massive financial crime with my name all over it. This is the story of how my silence drove him to madness, and how I used his own gala to expose every last lie. You need to hear this. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch. The monologue was clearly rehearsed. My husband, Julian, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of our meticulously designed home in a quiet, wealthy suburb of Austin, Texas, the setting sun backlighting him like a prophet. He had that look on his face, the one he got before delivering a speech at one of his charity galas, a mixture of grave importance and tragic beauty. He had asked me to sit. That was the first red flag. "Liam," he began, his voice a low, sonorous hum that he'd perfected over the years. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching lately, about my path, my purpose. The work I do with the foundation, it's not just a job, it's a calling. It requires a level of spiritual and emotional energy that is all-consuming." And just sat on our designer sofa, the one he'd picked out, and nodded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. We'd been married for 12 years. For at least the last 5, our marriage had been an empty, beautifully decorated room. The love had evaporated so slowly, I barely noticed it was gone, replaced by the suffocating fumes of his ego. He took a deep, theatrical breath. "And I've come to a difficult realization. To reach my full potential, to truly serve my mission, I need to be untethered. This life, our life, it's become comfortable, safe. And my soul, my art, it cannot grow in safe soil. It needs fire. It needs struggle." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes glistening with unshed, performative tears. "I'm leaving you, Liam. It's the hardest decision of my life, but my path requires me to walk it alone." There it was. He was leaving me. Not for another person. That would have been too simple, too vulgar for a man like Julian. He was leaving me for a concept, for his own mythology. I'm sure he expected a certain reaction, a collapse, tears. A desperate plea for him to reconsider, to tell me how I could be more inspiring, how I could be a better muse for his grand destiny. He had built the stage, set the lighting, and delivered his lines. All I had to do was play my part as the devastated, abandoned spouse, thereby validating the heart-wrenching gravity of his decision and his irresistible, tragic greatness. But the funny thing is, when he said the words, I didn't feel devastation. I didn't feel heartbreak. The overwhelming, all-consuming emotion that washed over me was relief. It was like a 50-pound weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying, was suddenly lifted from my shoulders. The daily performance of pretending to be captivated by his self-importance, the emotional labor of tending to his fragile ego, the exhaustion of living with a man who was perpetually the star of his own one-man show. It was over. So I didn't cry. I didn't even stand up. I just looked at him, this beautiful, tragic stranger in my living room, and I asked, in a perfectly calm voice, "Okay, when will you be moving your things out?" The silence that followed was more real and more profound than any part of his speech. His face, which had been arranged in lines of noble sorrow, seemed to short-circuit. The tragic mask flickered, revealing a flash of pure, bewildered fury. It was like a magnificent actor had forgotten his lines because a stagehand just walked through the scene and asked what time it was. I had broken the fourth wall of his drama. I had refused to play my part. "What?" he stammered, the resonant baritone gone, replaced by a thin, reedy sound. And I said, "When will you be moving out?" I repeated, still calm. "I'll need to make arrangements. We'll have to discuss how to split things up. My name is on this house, too." This was not in his script. His narrative required a broken man begging him to stay. My quiet practicality was a profound insult. It implied that a life without him was not only survivable, but could be handled with the same emotional weight as scheduling a dentist appointment. His grand spiritual unburdening had been met with logistics. He stared at me, his jaw working silently. You don't care?" He finally managed to say, the disbelief in his voice thick. "I think it's for the best," I said honestly, and I meant it. That was the moment everything changed. He couldn't leave. Not like this. To leave a man who didn't care that he was leaving. That wasn't a tragic departure, it was an irrelevant one. It stripped him of all his power. And so, the mission to be untethered was immediately, and ironically, abandoned. It was replaced by a new, more urgent mission to make me feel the pain he believed was his due. He had to prove to me, and to himself, that he was the sun and I was just a planet, cold and lightless without him, so he didn't move out. I think I was hasty, he announced a few days later, his tone now one of magnanimous forgiveness, as if he were granting me a reprieve. Decision this monumental shouldn't be rushed. We need to transition. His transition was a Cold War fought in our open concept living space. It began with gaslighting. He would forget conversations we'd had about separating our finances. When I'd bring up getting the mediator, he'd look at me with pained confusion. "Liam, why are you so obsessed with the material aspects of this? I'm trying to handle this with grace and emotional honesty, and you're talking about lawyers. It's really disappointing." He started a subtle but effective smear campaign among our circle of friends, most of whom were donors or board members for his nonprofit, the Vanguard Arts Foundation. He would confide in them, his voice heavy with sorrow, about how he was trying to navigate this difficult time, but that I had become emotionally distant and unreceptive. He painted me as the cold, unfeeling one, the one who was making his noble suffering so much harder. Friends who used to greet me with warm hugs now gave me hesitant, pitying looks. They saw a man in pain and the heartless husband who was the cause of it. They didn't see the truth, that my crime was my refusal to perform a heartbreak I did not feel. The real escalation was financial. For our entire marriage, I, an architect with a steady and significant income, had deposited my salary into a joint account. Julian, whose work at the nonprofit paid a laughably small salary, managed all the finances. It was his domain. He said it freed me up to focus on my concrete work while he handled the more fluid world of investments and philanthropy. It was, I now realized, a mechanism of control. Suddenly, my credit cards started getting declined. When I asked him about it, he'd sigh, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. The foundation had an unexpected expense, Liam, a new artist residency program. I had to move some funds around. You have to understand, the needs of the many. Sometimes they have to outweigh the needs of the one. I thought you supported my work. He was holding our life hostage, using our joint finances as a weapon. He was going to make me feel his importance one way or another. If I wouldn't give him the emotional validation he craved, he would make me suffer a practical one. He was trying to break me, to force me into the role of the desperate, dependent spouse he needed me to be. That was his mistake. He thought my silence was weakness. He thought my calmness was apathy. He didn't realize that in his attempt to punish me, he had finally given me a reason to do something I hadn't done in 12 years. Look at the numbers. I was an architect. I dealt in blueprints, in structures, in foundations. I knew that if a building looked wrong, it was because the foundation was rotten. And our financial life suddenly looked very, very wrong. One night after he'd gone to bed, in the master bedroom of course, while I was relegated to the guest room, I sat down at my computer. I wasn't just a spurned husband anymore. I was an investigator. I opened our joint bank accounts online, and I started to follow the money. I was determined to untangle my life from his. I had no idea that I was about to pull a thread that would unravel not just our marriage, but his entire fraudulent world. The first thing I did was hire a forensic accountant. I knew my way around blueprints, not balance sheets, and I wasn't going to let my own ignorance be a weapon Julian could use against me. I found a woman named Evelyn Reed, a sharp, no-nonsense professional in her late 50s, who looked at my preliminary summary of the situation with the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who knows exactly where the tumor is. "And so your husband runs a nonprofit, controls all the joint assets, and is restricting your access to your own money while playing the victim," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "This is going to be messy, and I'd be willing to bet my pension it's also illegal." My legal standing to investigate was clear. My name was on the joint accounts, and I was a named co-founder, a silent partner, I'd always thought. on the initial incorporation documents for the Vanguard Arts Foundation. For years I'd seen that as an honor. Now I saw it for what it was, a liability. Evelyn's first piece of advice was crucial. I keep playing your part. Let him think you're the cold, defeated man he wants you to be. Don't let him know you're digging. The moment he suspects, he'll start shredding, both literally and digitally. So, I became the ghost in my own home. I was quiet, unobtrusive. I let Julian's condescending remarks and theatrical sighs wash over me. I endured the pitying looks from our friends at the few social events I couldn't avoid. Inside I was a coiled spring of fury, but on the outside I was a placid lake. All the while, Evelyn and I were working in the shadows. She started with the nonprofit's public filings, the Form 990s that all charities are required to submit to the IRS. They were, on the surface, clean. They showed significant donations coming in and significant expenses going out, categorized under broad, vague headings like artist support grants, and community outreach, and operational costs. But when we cross-referenced those filings with the raw data from our joint bank accounts, the story began to unravel. The artist support grants were the biggest red flag. The foundation supposedly gave out grants to struggling artists. But there were no artists. Not really. The payments weren't going to individuals. They were going to a series of LLCs with generic names: Creative Endeavors LLC, Canvas Solutions Group, Patron Holdings. And when Evelyn ran a search on those LLCs, she found they were all registered to one person: Julian. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't funding artists, he was funding himself. He was taking tax-deductible donations from wealthy patrons, funneling the money through the nonprofit, and then paying it out to his own shell companies under the guise of grants. From there, the money was being used to pay for his custom-tailored suits, his first-class flights to Art Basel, the lease on his Porsche, and the down payment on a vacation condo in Miami that I had never even heard about. This wasn't just a vanity project. This was a sophisticated, years-long scheme to commit tax fraud and embezzlement on a massive scale. The nonprofit wasn't a charity. It was a money laundering machine designed to fund his extravagant lifestyle while he played the part of the selfless philanthropist. The worst part was my own complicity. As we dug deeper, I saw my own signature, digitally forged, on dozens of documents authorizing transfers and approving expenses. He had used my name, my reputation as a stable, successful architect, to lend legitimacy to his fraudulent enterprise. If the whole thing ever collapsed, the paper trail would lead directly to both of us. He hadn't just been using me for my income, he'd been using me as a shield. I know why war, and da too. His parting shot about my being uninspiring and holding him back was the most grotesque irony of all. My steady, legitimate career was the very foundation his entire house of cards was built on. The full picture was so much uglier than I could have imagined. I felt a wave of shame, of stupidity. How could I have been so blind? But Evelyn was pragmatic. "Don't beat yourself up, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice firm. "Men like your husband are masters of the narrative. They create a world, and they make you a character in it. It's not your fault you believe the story. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with the truth?" He knew what I had to do. I wasn't just going to divorce him, I was going to dismantle him. I was going to take the narrative he had so carefully constructed and burn it to the ground. The opportunity presented itself on a silver platter. The Vanguard Arts Foundation's annual Starry Night Gala was in 2 weeks. It was the crown jewel of Julian's social calendar, an absurdly expensive black tie event where he would hold court, charm wealthy donors out of their money, and give a grand speech about the sacred importance of art. It was his temple. And I was going to tear it down, stone by stone. Evelyn compiled everything into a single devastating portfolio: the falsified grant applications, the bank statements showing the flow of money to the shell companies, the deeds to the secret condo, the forged signatures. It was an open and shut case of wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. We made 3 copies. The first copy went to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division via a formal whistleblower complaint. The second went to the State Attorney General's office. The third copy, the one for his public execution, was for a journalist, not just any journalist. I reached out to a woman named Maria Flores, a notoriously tenacious investigative reporter for the Austin American-Statesman known for taking down corrupt politicians and crooked businessmen. I sent her an anonymous encrypted email with a single subject line. The patron saint of Austin's art scene is a fraud. I attached one document, the bank statement showing a $100 grant being paid to one of Julian's shell companies, and a corresponding statement from that company's account showing a $95, then zero payment for the Porsche. Maria Flores called me within the hour. The night of the gala, I declined to attend, telling Julian I wasn't feeling up to it. He was thrilled. He could now play the part of the noble husband, carrying on bravely while his emotionally unstable spouse sulked at home. I watched him leave, dressed in a tuxedo that I now knew was paid for with stolen money. I didn't stay home. I went to a quiet bar downtown, ordered a whiskey, and pulled up the live stream of the event on my phone. At 9 p.m., just as Julian was taking the stage to a round of thunderous applause, Maria Flores's article dropped. The headline was explosive. Vanguard Arts Foundation, a hollow shell for founder's lavish lifestyle, whistleblower alleges. I watched the live stream as, in the crowd, phones began to light up. A confused murmur rippled through the ballroom. People were looking down at their screens, then up at the man on the stage, their faces shifting from adoration to confusion to dawning horror. Julian, oblivious for a moment, launched into his speech. Art, he boomed, is the lifeblood of a community. It requires sacrifice, but no one was listening. The murmur grew into a roar. He faltered, his eyes scanning the room trying to understand what was happening. He saw a sea of illuminated faces, all reflecting his own ruin. I took a long, slow sip of my whiskey. The fire he had wanted so desperately, the struggle his soul supposedly needed, I had given it to him. His carefully constructed world was burning, and all I had to do was give the truth a little light and air. My silence hadn't been apathy, it had been a fuse, and it had just reached the dynamite.